Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and these are the introductory lectures to the subject of psychopathology. Now, this is a huge subject. It's really where psychology got its start. Everyone was initially interested in figuring out how the mind went wrong, how people became mentally ill. Virtually all of the original studies in psychology were about that. There wasn't very much at all invested in what mental health is, just pathology. And very quickly, it was recognized by Freud quite early, and then other thinkers as well, that there is a fundamental break between the brain and the mind. In 1938, and forgive me for reading this, but it's absolutely essential for anyone who has an interest in psychopathology to recognize this fundamental distinction between the brain and the mind and how that has affected our understanding of psychopathology. In 1938, Freud wrote, just a year or so, a little less than a year before he died, he said, quote, "Psychoanalysis makes a basic assumption, the discussion of which is reserved to philosophical thought, but the justification for which lies in its results." This is it. "We know two kinds of things about what we call our psyche or mental life. Firstly, its bodily organ and scene of action, the brain or nervous system. And on the other hand, our acts of consciousness, which are immediate data and cannot be further explained by any sort of description. Everything that lies in between is unknown to us, and the data do not include any direct relation between these two terminal points of our knowledge." What he's saying, shockingly, is that there's no connection between the brain and the mind, between the brain and consciousness. And virtually everyone today in the modern world thinks that there is a direct connection. And they believe that new studies in genetics and new studies in brain chemistry and, of course, neurology, which is all the rage nowadays, has made some kind of understandable, accessible, direct causal link between brain function, neurological function, and human behavior. And the truth is, starting in 1938, Freud laid this statement out, and the truth is, no one's touched it since. All of our Human Genome Project research in genetics, all of the amazing technological developments in brain scan technology, PET scans, CAT scans, functional MRIs, wherein we can reach into the functioning human brain and see virtual live video of its neurological functioning. And yet, the truth is, no one in any of our modern sciences has made the leap that Freud said couldn't be made, at least as of 1938, that we have now correlation. We have vague constellations and locations in the brain where activity happens. We can see that. And there's some correlation to some human behaviors. But the first thing that needs to be understood in psychopathology is the fact that what Freud said in 1938 still holds true. We have weak correlation and as yet no causation. Popular examples, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Everyone seems to think that it's some sort of brain chemistry disorder. That's said over and over, but the truth is there's not a single scientific study that can identify a specific neurological constellation with a specific ADHD-related behavior. It's rather astonishing. And I think in order to understand psychopathology, we must be honest about what science can show us and what other forms of research, like psychoanalytic methods, will allow us to infer about human behavior. This goes back to maybe the biggest area in psychology right now, and that's theory of mind. What Freud suggested is that we understand the brain really well, and we understand it now 1,000 times better than he ever could, given our modern technologies. The problem is we haven't made much progress in understanding what the mind is. I think I mentioned this in one of my initial lectures. It's rather astonishing as well that the entire field of psychology has not yet been able to define the very focus of its entire study, the human mind. What is a mind? Where is the mind? How is it put together? How does it function? How does it go wrong? How is it healed? None of these questions have been answered in terms of a scientific methodology. I think we've made leaps and bounds in terms of understanding development, in understanding the specifics and the symptoms of pathology. And we've come miles and miles in terms of therapeutic methodology. We know how to help people get better. But again, somewhat shockingly, we cannot and have not been able to define what the human mind is. We know how it functions. That's the difference. We understand how it functions, but there is still the gap that Freud laid out in 1938 between the brain and the mind and what the mind is. We can look at its function, and that's so far about the best we can do. Now, when Freud began, he was a neurologist in the 1880s, and he had absolute confidence that he was going to discover a psychology of brain function. He believed early that it was in the brain where all the key action was going to be. He's been called a biologist of the mind. And within about 10 years, he gave that up. He couldn't find the direct causal link. And through his researches, he created psychoanalysis, which has given us the method probably most successful in accounting for the function of the mind and explaining human behavior, both healthy and not healthy. But he walked away from the biology of human behavior very early. It seems that even in the field of philosophy now, there's been a shift. Since the 1920s, philosophy has been taken up by what they called analytic philosophy, which was really a variation on sort of cognitive, that the brain or the mind was really about the function of language. And it looks like over the last 10 or 15 years, the entire field of philosophy and psychology have sort of merged in their efforts to understand the mind. Philosophy now is dominated by a way of thinking about theory of mind. I think psychology is also struggling with the same thing, and perhaps someday we will realize Freud's great vision of a biology of the mind. With all our new technologies, maybe someday we will be able to link the brain and the mind in a more direct way. Up until now, we have not been able to do that with any success whatsoever, and Freud's gap remains as powerful now as it was then. Okay, with that as background, there are two primary theories of psychopathology. I will call them the descriptive method, and the dynamic method. The descriptive method is the one used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, what everyone now basically accepts as the Bible of mental illness. It is a master list of all currently recognized mental illnesses. If you are diagnosed and you are not diagnosed within the context of what they call the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, then insurance companies will not pay for your treatment unless you're within that model, unless you can be diagnosed with one of the categories in the DSM or one of the variations within those categories, then it is effectively not recognized as a legitimate mental illness in at least Western medicine, specifically American medicine. Now, there are literally hundreds, and I suspect if you add up all of the variations, well over 1,000 possibilities. So it isn't like it's a narrow list and you might be left out if you think you have an issue. And I don't think I've ever heard of a case where someone came to a therapist with a series of symptoms and the therapist couldn't find somewhere in the diagnostic manual to plug him or her. The core of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is the assumption of the medical model. When you go to see a doctor and you present certain symptoms, there is decision trees in medicine. There is research that backs up certain blood tests that reveal certain maladies or certain illnesses. There are x-rays, other scanning technologies that can show a dysfunction in the body. And when you come into a doctor, for example, many years ago, I had an appendicitis attack. I walked into the doctor with a bad stomach ache and a small lump in my lower abdomen, and I walked him through my symptoms. And I was really careful because I knew that he and I were on the same page. I knew that I had to be as totally honest as possible, as clear as possible, that if I was, then I might be healed, and if I wasn't, and he was mistaken, my life was perhaps at risk. And so he and I were working very closely together to list the specific symptoms in as clear and accurate and as scientific a way as possible. It worked. I had a minor surgery and was well after it was over. The medical model lists symptoms. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual also lists symptoms. There is no discussion of mental health and wellness. There is no discussion of childhood developmental histories. It is a complete focus in the here and now symptomology that a patient brings into a clinician. There are checklists. There are, you have to get 5 out of 9 plus several subcategories, and if you meet the criteria, then the diagnosis is appropriate. And each and every one of those criteria reflect a symptom that can be ascertained by either observation of the patient, observation of the clinician, self-referral or other referrals of the patient, and it has the feel of the scientific medical model. You come in with symptoms, you get a diagnosis, treatment begins. Now, the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic model of psychopathology has a completely different approach to understanding how the mind functions. There really isn't a discussion in the DSM about mind, about self. It's just a series of symptoms. They apply or they do not, parallel to the medical model, and then treatment, which is researched based on the categories, is supposed to proceed in ways that reflect the research on what has been affected in those relatively discrete categories. Now, there's a lot of conflict in my field between the dynamic and the descriptive methods, but my sense is really they need not be in conflict. If you looked at my first introductory lecture, I talked about a story of an ancient Indian, subcontinent Indian story of the 7 blind wise men and the elephant. It's a fabulous story, and it described 7 blind wise men who were brought in by the leader and told to examine an elephant and tell the leader what an elephant is. And of course, the blind wise men, blind from birth, had never seen an elephant before. So they examined it, and one examined the leg and said, an elephant is like a tree. And the other felt the side of the elephant and said, an elephant is like a wall. And one ran into the tail. An elephant is like a rope. And the story was, of course, are they right or are they wrong? And the answer is wrong question. They're wrong because an elephant is not like those narrow things, but they're also partly right. That's the key. They each had a piece of the elephant. And in psychopathology, the goal ought to be to get as many pieces of the patient's mind as possible. And I think the descriptive method gives us a great deal of very important data to work with. And the dynamic model does exactly the same thing. So I'm going to take the position that we ought to integrate and stop what is basically a feud among academicians and clinicians. And let's try to put the elephant back together, because unless we can use all the data we have, we're serving our patients less well. So let me begin with a discussion of the DSM. Again, the universally recognized necessary mental health document in American psychotherapy. Historically, when a clinician diagnosed a patient, they really only had 2 categories, the categories that Freud laid down to begin with. You were either neurotic or you were psychotic. And initially, that's how he thought about it. It was a relatively simple nosology, categorization. And that worked fine. The problem with that is if I say someone is psychotic and some other clinician says someone is psychotic, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the same thing? There wasn't much standardization, and the purpose of the DSM and the purpose of narrowing these categories to specific symptom checklists was to provide some standardization. So if we're talking about a major depressive episode in a patient, and I'm talking to my colleagues, or I'm getting supervision, or I want to refer the patient to another clinician, I can talk in a language that we all understand, that we're all on the same page, which facilitates research, facilitates clinician interaction, helps for referrals. So the DSM initially, with its descriptive method, really was designed to solve a problem, and it did a fabulous job of solving that problem. We now can, using the 5 axes of the DSM, and I'm going to get to each one of them in just a minute, communicate with other clinicians in ways that I think do nothing but benefit the patient. So in order to do a diagnosis within the DSM, you have to evaluate 5 separate, what they call axes. So axis number 1 are what we call the clinical disorders. Now that parallels, interestingly, Freud's neurotic categories. Basically, this is the vast majority of mental illnesses that most people think about when they talk about mental illness. There's a list of them: mood disorders, depression and its variations, anxiety disorders, panic attack, ADHD, those kind of things. Somatoform disorders, disorders that involve the somatization or the embodiment of anxiety, ulcers, psoriasis, some forms of asthma or embodied illnesses, sexual and gender identity disorders, and several others. Axis 1 is about the most common and most commonly treatable mental illnesses. And they all have that descriptive quality. You go down the checklist of symptoms. If your client meets the checklist requirements, then you can put that diagnosis on them. Axis 2 is personality disorders. Now, again, interestingly, for a document like the DSM, which claims to be exclusively a cognitive behaviorist theory. Now, again, in my field, a dramatic split right down the middle. There's cognitive behaviorists and there's psychoanalytic types. The cognitive behaviorists function on the classical conditioning of certain behaviors and the function of language, which they think is primary in the structure of the mind. The psychoanalytic types talk about unconscious dynamics, childhood developmental issues, defense mechanisms. There doesn't seem to be a lot of communication between these two camps these days. There should be. And despite the DSM being exclusively now, at least, a cognitive behaviorist scientific research result, the first 2 axes reflect almost perfectly Freud's idea of neurotic versus psychotic. Axis 1, paralleling neurotic functioning. Axis 2, called personality disorders and mental retardation. But the personality disorders reflect very directly Freud's understanding of psychotic processes. Now, historically so, those 2 things seem awfully similar. 2 sides of the same coin, one might say. But then the DSM added 3 more axes, which I think make it absolutely essential to follow the DSM when I'm in my clinical work. The axis 3 are called the general medical conditions. And what is important is that you must, if you're a therapist, recognize that the mind isn't separate from the body. That old idea of the mind-body dichotomy simply, which goes back all the way to the French philosopher Descartes in the 1700s, I don't know anyone that actually believes that today. The mind and body are inextricably interwoven. And Axis 3 reflects that, I think, profound change in our understanding about what it means to be human. We are embodied minds. We are embodied creatures, and the body counts in terms of its effect on our mental functioning. So if you've got general medical conditions, the therapist needs to know. And the obvious examples to this, if I have high blood pressure, if I have a cardiac condition, a heart condition, my therapist had better know it. Therapy is difficult. It's painful sometimes. It evokes a great deal of anxiety. I mean, practically, if I'm not aware of a person's medical condition and they have a heart condition and I'm making deep rather profound, rather disturbing interpretations. I might, in the worst case scenario, precipitate a heart attack in my patient if I'm not aware of their medical conditions. Likewise, if a patient has recently been injured or undergone deep or important medical major surgery, of course that's going to have an effect on the way they interact with the clinician, how the clinician sees their mental functioning. There's no way it can't. So it's critically important that all clinicians follow the DSM's priorities here and make sure they have a very thorough medical history, including any current medical issues going on with any prospective patient. Axis 4 seems to me almost as important, if not more important. It's called psychosocial and environmental problems. Now, I joke, environmental problems doesn't mean they litter or are messy or don't recycle. Psychosocial and environmental problems mean, what is their circumstance? What is their life circumstance? My first job as a clinician was in an agency that worked with African-American homeless women, mothers, single mothers with 1 or 2 children under the ages of 4. It was a transitional housing program for recently homeless, and 15 out of the 16 were African-American women. And all of them had come from homes of, most of them, drug abuse, violence, difficult circumstances, sometimes dramatically difficult circumstances. Well, I mean, it's patently obvious that any clinician who doesn't understand the current life circumstances of his patient can't function well as a clinician. I had to know what their life circumstances were. I had to know where they had just come from, what they were experiencing, how they were managing it. If I didn't know that in some detail, I couldn't possibly diagnose them properly. And so the DSM's focus in Axis 4 on psychosocial problems, I think, is absolutely essential for competent clinicians to diagnose. The fifth axis, is called the Global Assessment of Functioning, the GAF, Global Assessment of Functioning. And we're Americans, we like science, we like numbers, and the GAF is quite simply a scale, 0 to 100, 0 to 10 being the worst possible mental illness, and 90 to 100 being superior functioning at every level. We want to establish a number for someone. We're just comfortable with that. So you have a list on page 34 of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from bottom to top, and every patient who gets diagnosed in accordance with the DSM will have a number assigned. For example, 60. 50 to 60. Moderate symptoms, e.g. flat affect and circumstantial speech, occasional panic attacks, or moderate difficulty in social, occupational, or school functioning, e.g. few friends, conflicts with peers or coworkers. So you could be that's most of us. Most of us are in the 50 and 60 range. If you're a little better than that, 60 to 70, some mild symptoms, etc. So the GAF is a relatively simple numerical equivalent that facilitates, I think, really well communication between clinicians. It doesn't do the patient much good. My best example of this is I had a patient I saw twice a week for a year, and he was married, and his wife had an opportunity to move to the East Coast for a career change that seemed favorable, and they were all, and I frankly agreed, that it was a very good career move, even though it would interrupt my patient's, the husband's, therapy. And he asked me to coordinate, to do a little research and help him find someone who did things a little bit like me. He liked what I was doing in the city that he was moving to on the East Coast. And I agreed to do that, and I had a chance to speak to a clinician, and he asked me, any general medical conditions? And I said, no, basically healthy as a horse. Psychosocial problems, not that I could speak of. He was a master's degree, highly educated, hadn't had any traumatic childhood developmental experiences, did not have any current crises in his life. What was his GAF, the guy said. I said 55 to 60 on a good day, on a bad day, maybe a little lower than that. And he went, okay. And what happened was we had this dialogue using the DSM, and that was our mutual language. He asked me what axis, and he said axis 2. I said, no, no personality disorders at all. No indication of that at all. Clearly axis 1, little anxiety, little depression. He said, okay, send him on. And so when my patient came to the door, this clinician was ready to take him in, kind of hit the ground running, and help the clinician, I think, prepare to be a good clinician to this patient. Great example. Now, I'd like to give a few examples, one example at least, of the details of the criteria. And again, bear with me, if you don't have access to a DSM, this may seem, the language here is a little odd, but it's odd because they're trying to mimic the medical model. So I'm going to walk through the criteria for major depressive episode. So there are A through E are the 5 criteria, and A has 9 subsets. So here it is. A, 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either 1, depressed mood, or 2, loss of interest or pleasure. Number 1, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by either subjective report, feels sad or empty, or observation made by others, appears tearful. Note, children and adolescents can be irritable mood. Number 2, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. Number 3, significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, and some more. Number 4, insomnia or hypersomnia, nearly every day. Number 5, and the list goes on. Now, it sounds very scientific. It sounds very specific, that if you have those, well, it's clear you should be in this category. But what happens if you look closely is that though the language sounds scientific, sounds objective, sounds clear, if looked at a little more closely, we have a great deal of wiggle room here. 5 or more of the following symptoms. So you only have to have 5 out of the 9. And yet, if I have 1 through 5 and you have 4 through 9, which are very different things, as long as I have a little bit of number 2, then we can be put in the same category. Now, these symptoms, if it's only 5 out of 9, might present a very different clinical picture, depending on what constellation of 5 you get. In addition, depressed mood. What does that mean? What exactly is a depressed mood? By what standard do you judge depressed? What does mood mean exactly? How is that reflected in the person's subjective experience, objective behavior? Most of the day. What does that mean? I mean 13 out of 24 hours? 8 out of 12 hours of wake time? Nearly every day? Is that 5 out of 9 days? Is that 9 out of 10 days? When you look at it closely, what you find is rather astonishing variation, vagueness, subjective value judgments in some ways, going into what is supposed to be a scientific checklist of objective criteria and symptoms. And that may be the biggest problem with the DSM. It is the current standard, and I think it has made diagnosis more consistent than it was before. That's clear. If two clinicians were just talking about whether or not their patients were psychotic, there was potential for rather radical differences. We now have at least somewhat narrowed down the criteria. And yet this fails, I think, fails rather dramatically any test of science and the scientific method. But that's what we're left with, and as long as you know that going in, you can deal with the variations. Now, I left out the other criteria. So there's A, 5 out of 9. B, symptoms do not meet criteria for a mixed episode, see page 365. So there's negative criteria. It isn't something else. Or C, symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. This one is central to most all of the diagnostic categories. It has to cause clinically significant distress to the patient subjectively, or impairment in social or occupational functioning, okay? Well, what happens if I'm in denial? What happens, I have a patient right now who's, you might fairly call him schizoid or withdrawn. That's his main defense. He's not really there. He's quite withdrawn. He has almost no emotion. He reports no distress at all. He reports no problem in social functioning. His wife may be about to divorce him, but he sees that as her problem, not his. So this is one of those categories which on the surface, again, makes perfect sense and would be obviously necessary to diagnose a mental illness. The person is under distress. He's having difficulty. He's not functioning in the real world in an appropriate adaptive way. And yet there's lots of patients who would not report clinical distress for reasons like I just described. Symptoms are not due, this is D, not due to the direct physiological effects of a substance. So there can't be a substance-induced disorder or a derivative of addiction processes. So we have to, again, sort of a negative. It can't be something else. Or E, are not better accounted for. So there's 3 different variations on, let's make sure it's not something else, or it's not better accounted for by something else. Let's make sure we're accurate here in the cause of the thing. So without going into any more detail, which isn't necessary, I can conclude the idea that, yes, with these checklists of symptom lists, these lists of symptoms, we have dramatically, I think, improved the specificity of a diagnosis. And yet we have not bridged the question of brain and mind. We are not really in a medical model because these are all determined, these criteria are really determined by the experience of the patient's mind, not their brain. Yet, maybe someday. So with that as a limitation, and we need to know the limitations of a diagnostic system in order to use it efficiently and effectively. Here's one of the main dangers, is that we get lost in labels. I think the greatest critique of the DSM, as good as it is, and for as many reasons as it is good and useful, the main critique of it, besides the fact of its sort of pseudo-scientific nature, is the fact that these labels get thrown on people as if they have some kind of absolute equivalence, as if they have concrete meaning. Oh, you have a major depressive episode. As if it's similar to whether the person has an appendicitis, as if there's an equivalent to the medical model. And the simple fact is that isn't true yet, and we need to keep that in mind. All right. So let me shift now to the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic model. For this, I use Dr. Nancy McWilliams' great text, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. It's now in the 2nd edition, published in 2011. She is one of, I think, the world's experts in diagnosis, in psychopathology, and she comes from a psychoanalytic perspective. Now, she's very integrative. She's not narrow. She tries to incorporate as much of the elephant as possible, as much of the client's mind as possible. But she clearly comes, and I think is probably the best representative of the psychodynamic side of the house. I will be walking through that text in some detail. And the first thing that she mentions is that we do not have, and the DSM does not supply us, with any kind of definition of mental health. If we're going to talk about psychopathology, shouldn't we be able to discuss what mental health is? How do we know psychopathology, which sort of indicates a variation from the norm, something that deviates from health? It's psychopathological. Well, don't we have to understand what health means first in order to understand what psychopathology means? And there really is very little discussion of that. And I'm going to suggest that neither the psychodynamic model nor the descriptive model has done a very good job in describing what mental health is. Everyone has focused on the psychopathology, and I think it warrants at least a brief discussion of what health is. And everybody sort of has their own description of it, but I don't think anyone's gotten better than what Freud said 100 years ago, that mental health is really the ability to work and to love. And that's it. Nothing more complicated than that. Now, look at those terms closely and you do see some complications. A great psychoanalyst named Heinz Kohut in the 60s or 70s added one caveat to Freud's definition of mental health. He said, yes, mental health means to be able to work and to love, and we all ought to be able to feel some joy in the process. So he adds some joy in the process of working and loving. And that makes perfect sense to me and seems necessary for a decent definition of health. So to work, to be productive, to be creative. And I don't mean that like Michelangelo and Mozart. I mean that in terms of every human being's innate need for creative work, innate need to be productive, to grow, to become stronger, and to live in a world where what they do makes a difference and that they feel themselves to be productive members of society. I don't think this is a luxury. Creativity is a necessity. And to be able to work, I think that's what Freud meant by that. And the other seems kind of obvious, to love. We are relational creatures. Solitary confinement is punishment. We need others around us. We need to be in love to live a happy, joyous life. Again, solitary confinement is punishment. So if we cannot love, something's wrong with us. And we ought to be in relationships that provide us with a decent amount of love. No one's talking about perfection. No one's talking about idealization. And no one's talking about being Michelangelo or Mozart either. We need creative work. We need good enough love in our lives. And if we have those things, most of the time we can feel some joy in the process. So that's my standard for mental health. And I think if you keep that in mind, then the discussion of psychopathology in either the dynamic or the descriptive methods make a little bit more sense. Now, McWilliams' first reaction to the descriptive method is to suggest humans are more than a list of symptoms, that we are, human beings are complex wholes rather than collections of symptoms. And I think she's right. There's something about our minds that we have to take into consideration, that our sense of being, our sense of self, feels more than just a collection of symptoms. If it doesn't, something's wrong. And when we try to limit what it means to be human to a collection of symptoms, we miss something. And her almost poetic conclusion here is, how pale are even our most elegant and satisfying formulations next to the mystery that is human nature. I mean, that's poetry. How pale are even our most elegant and satisfying formulations next to the mystery that is human nature. All of our theories, all of our grand nosologies, all of our categories, all of our ways of thinking about the human mind, really, at the end of the day, don't hold a candle to what it means to sit with another human being and really try to understand who they are at a deeper level. And I think that's the danger in the descriptive method, that we can reify, concretize categories of mental illness and forget the patient. And I think even in psychodynamic ways of thinking, that tendency has to be struggled against constantly. So, key lesson in psychopathology: don't lose the patient in all of your theories about mental illness. Good advice always. The other thing that Nancy McWilliams notices, and I think is not addressed adequately in a descriptive method, is that things seem to be changing at a cultural or historical level. Freud's patient population was relatively high-functioning neurotics. They had conflicts over issues of sexuality and aggression, but by and large they were mostly integrated whole individuals functioning adequately, mostly, in society. And when they didn't, treatment was available. What McWilliams points out, and what I think virtually every historian of psychology has concurred with, and even clinicians who've been in business for a long time have noticed, even in 10, 20 years, is that our clinical populations seem to be getting more and more disturbed. We almost never see high-functioning neurotics, at least the type that Freud saw, even granting radical differences in culture, language, and historical period. The nature of most therapists' clinical populations today is significantly more disturbed than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. That's a fascinating discussion, and I will come back to it, why that is, perhaps, in the lectures on social psychology and group psychology. For purposes now, we just need to recognize that people seem to be getting more and more disturbed, and clinicians are having to deal with pathology that seems much more serious. We're seeing more Axis 2s than we used to, and the Axis 1s are more serious than they have been before. I think most clinicians would agree to that. Unlike the descriptive model, McWilliams is not trying to be directly scientific. She's not claiming that her theory is right and scientific and objective and it's the truth. She's not claiming that at all very clearly up front in her preface and introduction to the text. She wants to be useful. That's her goal. Can I help clinicians with this way of understanding about pathology? Can I help clinicians treat their patients more successfully? That's all she wants. To be useful, not right. She does make one other assumption that's a little bit in conflict with some folks today. She doesn't believe that culture is critical. She believes it's important, but she believes that, and there's some support for her in genetic research now, that she's describing an approach to psychopathology that is universally human. We may have different cultures, we may speak different languages, we may have different habits and manners of dress and manners of speech and cultural habits, but her fundamental approach is this is how the human mind is put together. This is how it functions universally, that we're all more human than otherwise, and the differences in culture are stylistic. That can be important, and it's important for therapists to understand every patient's cultural background. I'll come back to that at some length later. Perhaps that's a good place to put in the Axis 4 material on psychosocial and environmental concerns. Do you want to know whether a person is from the Middle East or from China? I have patients from the Middle East, from Africa, and from Asia currently, and it is essential for me to know their cultures. And yet McWilliams is saying we're all more human than otherwise, and that in fact we need to recognize that this way of thinking can be applied to every human being, and we don't need to compartmentalize people solely by their cultures. Again, a subject of some social dispute in our culture here today. But that's her approach. Okay, comment on terminology. She is trying to stay with the patient's experience. She's trying to see the patient as a whole and not compartmentalizing symptom checklists. She recognizes that even with that, there's a danger of reification. There's a danger of the misuse of language. That is always a danger in my field, regardless of your theories. There's no value-neutral language. And I think that realization makes us all very humble. The nature of the way we use language, the nature of our words, the baggage that comes with in psychology is tricky. It fools us into thinking we know stuff we don't. We whip a label on a patient, major depressive episode, and we think we understand them. Well, one must keep constant vigilance on the reality that a label does not equal knowledge. That because I have a symptom checklist or because a person meets certain criteria psychoanalytically, that isn't necessarily who the person is. It certainly isn't who they may become. It may be a very narrow snapshot, partial snapshot of what's happening now. But if that's where my focus narrows down to, my patient's in trouble, and I'm not a very good therapist. So again, it feels like an inevitable conflict, but the way she describes it, I think, is healthy. There's tension. There's tension between our use of language, there's limitations on how we use language, and we must use language. There's no way around it. That's how we communicate. It's not a very efficient tool. As anyone who's been in a relationship knows, communication is always the problem, but that's exactly the same problem in discussions of psychopathology. Our language doesn't fit our experience, and it certainly doesn't fit very cleanly our experience of mind and our experience of distress. So she wants to stay very aware of the potential misuse of language. The other thing she comments on that I think is dead on accurate is that concepts change over time. Concepts seem to be watered down over time, or categories seem to be expanded radically beyond what they were originally used for. Several examples. The word borderline now, which we'll talk about later, it is now often loosely used as a category of relatively severe mental illness. Oh, that person's kind of borderline. Well, that doesn't tell us very much. And what has happened is it was initially used as the borderline in between neurotic and psychotic, Freud's original formulation, and back in the late 1800s. Clients were coming into therapists, and the therapists had a hard time categorizing them. Are they neurotic or are they psychotic? Well, it turns out they had elements of a little of both. And so this category of, that's what borderline means. It's on the borderline between neurotic and psychotic. That's where it comes from. Nobody hardly seems to know that anymore. But what has happened is more and more patients, as I think sort of culturally things have unraveled a bit, more and more patients became more and more disturbed, and that category expanded to the point where now it's almost a wastebasket category, that everyone that comes in with any significant problem gets sort of shoehorned into the borderline category, and it has drained it of any very much clinically useful information or clinically useful data. The same thing has happened in diagnoses of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I read some data not long ago that said in the last 5-year period there'd been a 1,700% increase in diagnoses of ADHD, mostly among younger adolescent boys. Well, how is that possible? Has there been an epidemic of ADHD? Of course not. Things haven't changed that much in the last 5 years. What's happened is more and more clinicians and teachers and school psychologists have been shoehorning more and more adolescent, mostly boys, into that category without thinking about it very much. We have a problem, call it ADHD, give it some medication, and we can move on. The misuse of diagnostic categories appears now to be rather rampant. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is now coming out in a 5th edition. By the time this video gets completed, it's likely to already be on the street. And the biggest change is the incorporation of what they call the autistic spectrum disorder category, which is taking the traditional diagnostic category of autism and radically expanding it as a gigantic umbrella category under which many, if not most, of the early childhood developmental disorders are now covered, so that the increase, and there has been a similar increase in autistic diagnosis similar to ADHD, is that we're going to see inevitably a radical increase in this category's use. Does that mean we have more autistic children than before? Maybe, but impossible to imagine that our family structure and our genetics have changed so radically in the last 10 years that there could be that kind of 1,000, 1,700, 2,000% increase in a diagnostic category. The numbers suggest a misuse of the diagnostic category, not an actual increase in legitimate diagnoses. McWilliams points out that difficulty and cautions us all, again, to not misunderstand a label for knowledge. We'll come back to some more of that a little bit later. Now, After all of that, one might feel the tendency to throw your hands up and give up. Well, why diagnose at all? If the medical model isn't very accurate and only sort of kind of narrows things down, and the dynamic model has got a tendency to be lost in language, well, why don't we just throw our hands up and stop pretending that we're diagnosing accurately? McWilliams gives us some very good reasons why we must diagnose. It's necessary. Diagnostic efforts are necessary for the following reasons. A therapist cannot plan a treatment without understanding what the problem is. You know, it's like taking your car into the mechanic. The first thing the mechanic's got to do is figure out what the problem is. He can't fix anything if he hasn't diagnosed the problem accurately. I think exactly the same thing is true for clinicians. If a patient comes in with depression and I misdiagnose him with anxiety, I'm not going to embark on a course of treatment that does much good. So treatment planning is obviously essential. This parallels the medical model in both major theories of psychopathology. You've got to understand at least the basics of the problem or you can't fix it. I mean, if ever there's common sense in my field, that's the most common sense position I know, and it's accurate. Prognostic implications is her second reason. Prognostic implications. My patient needs to know. I need to know. Given a particular diagnostic category, what's the trajectory? How long is treatment supposed to last? What are the odds of it getting better? There are treatment categories. There are diagnoses that are relatively mild, not difficult to treat over a reasonable period of time, and there are others that suggest almost a lifetime of struggle. I think a patient has a right to know how the therapist thinks about their case. I think the therapist needs to understand for their own sort of preparation for that patient what's in store for both of them. Prognostic implications is a strong indicator of the need to diagnose accurately. You could throw in, number three, consumer protection. This goes way, well, maybe it isn't so far from the medical model. I think most people now think of themselves when they go to a doctor as a consumer of services. I think historically that wasn't true. I think doctors 100 years ago were considered almost gods. Their judgment was never questioned, ever. Freud was never sued by any patient, and he had thousands of patients over 40 or 50, almost 60 years, 50 years at least. He was never sued once. No one ever complained about his treatment as a medical doctor or as a psychoanalyst. That was common back then, very common. Now, almost the opposite is the case. And I think it makes sense to suggest to modern patients that they have a right in some ways as a consumer to know something about the doctor or the therapist's understanding of their case. The patient gets to participate. And if you diagnose a patient with something they disagree with, they have a right to find a different therapist. Now, the danger there, of course, obvious, is that patients will go therapist shopping till they find some diagnosis they're comfortable with, whatever's wrong with them, and that clearly is a problem. That's more of the tension, the inevitable tension that we just have to deal with. That's part of diagnosis in the 21st century. Another reason that it makes sense to diagnose is what McWilliams calls the communication of empathy. If I really do a good job, if I do a thorough background, if I go through a thorough evaluation of all 5 axes and the criteria and the social and the medical, or if I do a very thorough diagnostic workup from the perspective of child development and psychoanalytic theory, either way, both, what I present to the patient is understanding, empathy, the ability to feel like you're understood from the patient's perspective, the ability to feel like someone knows what's wrong, someone understands how you're suffering, someone, because of that, gives you some hope that it might be fixed. I think probably that by itself is enough to justify a solid diagnostic workup. The other side of that is forestalling flights from treatment. The idea that patients who often come to therapy in desperate need of therapy need to be managed in a way that best gives the opportunity for the therapist to do the work he or she can do. If you don't provide this sort of empathic diagnostic understanding, very frequently patients will bail on therapy, and that experience can be traumatic all by itself. So it's important for those reasons, among others, to ensure that a therapist does a very thorough workup. Okay, let me summarize briefly the psychoanalytic or the psychodynamic versus the descriptive diagnostic issues. The DSM has no definition of health or wellness. But the psychodynamic folks, other than Freud's simple definition of the ability to love and to work and to feel some joy in the process, even the psychodynamic folks don't spend much time talking about that either, and we should spend more time. The truth is, neither the descriptive method, the DSM method, has been very accurate. The validity and reliability of the diagnostic categories when they've done subsequent research has been at best disappointing. They have attempted to be scientific, and it hasn't worked very well, quite frankly. I think in both cases, the danger of the reification of diagnostic labels is always a danger, and that we must be aware that language is almost inevitably to some degree misused. A problem we have not talked about that I think is also a problem for both sides of the discussion here is that right now third-party payers, insurance companies, governmental agencies are getting involved in the funding of mental health care. And that's a 600-pound gorilla in the room that causes all kinds of complications. Perhaps we can leave that for another day, but if anyone thinks a third-party payer can get involved in the treatment process and it not have an effect on that process, hasn't done this work for very long. Right now, if you diagnose someone with an Axis I disorder, most of the time, most insurance companies will pay for it. If you diagnose someone with an Axis II disorder, they will not pay for it. And the theory apparently is that if you're that broken, you can't be fixed. In a way, it almost sounds like an insurance company talking about automobile accident. If it isn't too serious, we can repair it. If it's too serious, you're considered totaled and they won't pay for it. They won't pay for the repair. That's the connection. Axis II diagnoses, pervasive personality disorders, will not be paid for by a third-party payer. It's astonishing. Those are the folks that need the help the most, but if somebody else is paying for it, they get to make the rules. There's an old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. I think in this case that is painfully true. Lastly, we have the struggle in both sides to fit the diagnostic categories to the patient. In both sides there's a problem with that, and McWilliams wants us to keep focused on the whole human being. That makes perfect sense. There is the danger of establishing categories that are more about the therapist and the patient's comfort than the truth of it. The other problem is we have a tendency in both camps to make diagnoses based on the immediate manifest symptoms. But over the course of time and looking back historically, we may see a very, very different picture. So we can't slap a label on and leave it. We have to be fluid about it. We have to recognize that these things can change. They're not like a medical model where a disease is a disease is a disease, and it is until it's cured. That doesn't work in this field at all. Things change, and we need to stay open to the development of the patient's mind. So, at the risk of bleeding over a little into the lectures on psychotherapy, I think as a clinician prepares to diagnose or to think about diagnostic issues, two things have to be kept in mind, and I will come back to this in the lectures on therapy. If a clinician can exercise what I call benevolent curiosity, if instead of trying to pretend we're scientists looking under a microscope at a cell or trying to find some chemical compound, if we can sort of step back and exercise benevolent curiosity, and, and the words seem obvious, benevolence, the idea, if a monarch, if a king is a benevolent leader, then he has his people's interests in mind, then he cares, then he's respected, loved even sometimes. Curiosity, you want to know what's going on. You bring to the table what Melanie Klein thought was almost an instinct, that we're curious creatures. We want to know stuff. Children are intensely curious about things. And I think adults who are healthy also have a kind of natural curiosity. And if a clinician can be both benevolent, not trying to get to the truth of what went wrong, but really sort of curious about the way the patient's mind works, benevolently curious, non-judgmental. Now that being non-judgmental has become a cliche. It's almost one of those words that has become so misused we no longer really understand what it means. So, but I think in this context it means staying open to possibilities, and that's the part of the next key phrase, negative capability. Benevolent curiosity, negative capability, and that is the ability to sit with not knowing, to be able to let your uncertainty as a clinician be okay, that you don't have all the answers immediately, and if you're a patient, you're not going to know clearly what's going on for some time, and that's okay. There's no other way to do it. This isn't like some sort of chemical analysis that gets printed out on a scan machine and aha, we have the answer. McWilliams is right. Being human is a complicated thing, and we must see each other as whole, the therapist and the patient, and to be able to sort of take your time, to not feel urgent need to come to a conclusion, to slap a label on someone diagnostically, to me seems like the proper clinical practice, that you will get a better answer if you wait and if you're thorough. Now, you could put both of these phrases, benevolent curiosity and negative capability, you could put them under simple professionalism. You could put them under that heading easily. We don't make snap judgments. We're not supposed to make snap judgments. We're supposed to get the data first. And in psychopathology, it takes time to get the data thoroughly. I have had patients who I diagnosed, and a year, 2 years later, new information came out that caused me to fairly radically change the diagnosis. That is not unusual. And so to be able to simply be curious about the patient's mind without foreclosing too soon, without foreclosing ever, because you never know when new data is going to come in, seems to me to be a necessary factor, whatever your theory of pathology is. And I guess I will once again rely on Walt Whitman, the great American poet. Some of this stuff seems contradictory, and people sort of have a natural tendency, especially I think in the West, to want to be logically consistent. If you're contradictory, then something's wrong. And I think in psychopathology, the way to think about the human mind is that it's so complex that we are, in fact, contradictory creatures. We are in conflict. We do get pulled and hauled internally in multiple directions. And so that, Walt Whitman said it better than anyone, I think, when someone accused him of being contradictory. He said, and I quote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And that is also beautiful poetry about the complexity and multiple layers in every human mind. We are contradictory creatures. We do contain multitudes. And any clinician who is attempting to diagnose, and we all must diagnose for the reasons I suggested before, will do well to allow human contradiction to take its place. As McWilliams says, people are complicated. People are complicated, but their intricacies are not random. That, to me, grounds our work. We're human. We have a human nature. It's relatively consistent overall. People differ quite a bit, but they differ within the context of an identifiable, I think reasonably identifiable human nature. As McWilliams says, it's only absurd, ironic, or contradictory if you don't look deep enough. So our work in the coming lecture is to look deeply into the human mind and its dysfunction using a psychoanalytic or psychodynamic model. And thank you.